lot more. committee and all the other FDA committees is that everybody on the committee is a patient or a caregiver. So it's basically for patients and with patients and about patients. And if you're interested in that, I can connect you with my colleagues over in Center for Devices. It's actually one of the most popular advisory committees at FDA. A lot of people attend that one remotely. So that if you have questions, please reach out to me. They try to have a meeting. They had a meeting last year. They had a meeting the year before. So their goal is to try and have a meeting, hopefully every year or so. And then other ways to share your perspective and your voice with FDA. So we encourage people to attend FDA public meetings. And people don't typically know that you can do this, but if you go to FDA's homepage, which is listed right at the top, at the very bottom there's a section called Meetings, and if you click on that, it will show you all of the public meetings that FDA is having in the next couple months. And we understand that most people can't travel to DC or the DC area to go to these meetings, but you can also participate remotely, so you can join by webcast. So we encourage you to do that. That's a way to have your voice heard. There's always a section in public meetings called the open public comment, the open public hearing, and that's where you can sign up and you can deliver remarks in front of the committee. You can also do that in writing if you're not comfortable speaking or you're unable to speak. So we encourage you to do that. We also encourage you to familiarize yourself with the Federal Register. So when FDA has meetings that we're announcing, it's always posted in the Federal Register. If there are rules and guidances that FDA is posting, we post it in the Federal Register. And you can, if you have thoughts on what's posted or a perspective you want to share, you can submit those. You can submit comments in writing. So as soon as we announce it, you generally have either 30 to 60 days to submit written comments. And that is something that FDA looks at very, very thoroughly. There are guidance documents open that we get thousands of comments on. There are other documents that we don't get a lot of comments on at all, and people reach out to our office and say, hey, help us get more patients commenting on this. We want to know what patients think. So if you're curious about the Federal Register, from our website, from the patient's website at FDA, there's a section on there on how do you comment on the Federal Register. So if you go to fda.gov/patients, you can navigate to the Federal Register from there. And then finally, let's say that there is a product that has already been approved, and let's say that you are experiencing side effects, adverse events, and you want to let FDA know about that. You can do that through MedWatch. So MedWatch is our adverse event reporting system. It's voluntary, and so it's important, and this is an image of what sort of the page would look like from your phone. So if you click on the red button, it says report a problem. It'll take you to a web form, and you can submit information about what did you experience. So this could be an issue about a side effect that you've had, or it could be something related to, well, the directions on the label weren't clear. So these are things that FDA will evaluate to determine whether this is something that we need to inform people about. Do we need to change the labeling? Does something need to be recalled and removed from the market? So we will evaluate that. You can also sign up to get alerts as well. So if you click on the green button, that's a way to get, every time FDA has an announcement on a safety issue, you can get an email that comes to your inbox that talks about what that is. So again, this program is called MedWatch. And then finally, I'm just putting this, I put this slide up here just in case you wanted email addresses to some of these offices directly. But again, if you don't have time to write all that down, you can reach out to me and I can get you the right person. And then finally, I just want to say our contact information is here at the top. But in general, if you're walking away with anything, is that if you don't know where to go and you want to contact the FDA, just remember that you can reach out to me and my office, Patient Affairs, and we'll be happy to get you to the right person or the right place and help you get your question addressed as well. So, and that's it. So I don't know if anybody has questions, but I am happy to take questions.
Yep. We have a question right down there.
Hi.
We have a mic for you.
Here you go.
Yeah, just I wanted to have the name of the European. I didn't had the time to write it.
Yeah, I can go back, but we call it the cluster. And if you go to let's see, it's really far back. There we go. Yep.
And did they have the same way of working than you here, or it's different?
Do they have this? Can you repeat?
I mean, they can do the same thing that you are doing here, or?
They have similar programs.
Oh.
Patient engagement programs.
So they do have some patient engagement programs. I can't speak to them specifically because I don't represent them. But yeah, the idea is that we want to learn from each other. So maybe there's things that we can do better. So as an example, I mentioned the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee, which is the first committee that is everybody who's on it is a patient. And that was something that they were really interested in because they don't have that, they're not doing that currently in Europe. So they were very interested in hearing a little bit about how our first meeting went and what kind of steps and what kind of actions we're doing after that. So we meet sort of, well, right now, because they're moving their headquarters, we've had to temporarily stop those, but we expect to start that up again soon. So.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So there's lots of programs out there that talk about co-production, collaborative healthcare, patients as partners, and are, supported by big groups. But how do we bust through that hierarchy with primary caregivers to make it a collaboration? Because that's something that we can really struggle with, because there's all this research that says in rare diseases that collaboration is key. But sometimes when you go into that room, you're the underdog and they feel like maybe professional knows best. And it can be very difficult to create that collaboration where you work together as opposed to, they don't really listen to your experience very often.
Sure. Yeah. So I do want to say that, first of all, I just want to say that we acknowledge that it can be very difficult and intimidating to be able to talk about personal experiences that affect you or your child. And we acknowledge that's not easy to do, and it can be scary and intimidating, especially if you're in a room and you feel like you're not being heard. And actually, that's one of the main reasons why my office was created, because people said that they felt they didn't know where to go and how to do that. So we're trying to change sort of the perception of FDA so that we're a more welcoming, warm place. We like to kind of informally think of our office as sort of the office that serves as the advocates for the advocates. So think of us sort of like that front door. The biggest thing that we tell folks, especially if they have experience with rare diseases, is that we want you to advocate for your experience. And we know that it's not always easy, but sometimes it's a matter of being persistent and getting to the right person. That's the thing, is that if you have something so valuable to share, but you're not talking to the right person, you're not necessarily having your voice heard in the most effective way. And so that's another reason why our office can do that. But the patient-focused drug development meetings, the listening sessions that I talked about, those are opportunities because we from the FDA side make sure that we get those correct people in the room. So that those people genuinely do want to hear your perspective.
Yeah.
And we have a question over here.
So you're
No longer.
Thank you. All right? Okay. A quick question. This outreach is fine. The question behind our concerns also is the amount of funding for rare diseases. Can you speak a bit about how the budgeting for not your office, but the whole effort at opening up rare disease investigation and research?
So I can address that briefly or kind of loosely with a budget towards the entire FDA. I'm obviously don't have a budget type experience, but one of the things that FDA's biggest priority are rare diseases. And in fact, a lot of these programs that I mentioned, these patient programs, these are as a result of 21st century cures where money was allocated to HHS, to FDA, so that we could create these programs. From a very from my office perspective, we don't have a lot of funding. I'm actually we have 4 people in our office, and we're a new office, so we want to be able to continue to expand some of that. But as far as the funding, that really depends on Congress and how they are choosing to allocate funding towards HHS and then specifically to FDA. If you're interested in more of the research side, I would say the thing that you should look at most carefully is how the funding is going to the NIH, National Institute of Health, because a lot of the research comes directly from them. And I know that they are always in need of, they get a lot of funding, but you need more in order to do better quality research and more research, especially in rare disease areas.
Anybody else have any questions? We have one up there. Oh, you have another one down here? Okay. And then we have one up there in the back.
Okay.
So one of the things in the process to the parents that's going to matter is when you get to the stage of drug approval, where the FDA can really be a hindrance or it could be a big facilitator of that. The advantage of being in a rare disease space is in this room, you have like 50% of the entire affected population. Does that matter in terms of pace to completion, in terms of the approval process and all that kind of stuff? How does that factor of a rare disease contribute to the FDA's role in the overall scheme of the solution?
So FDA, and I can speak to this broadly, and if for more kind of detailed information, I'll connect you with I have folks for drugs that can talk more in a more detailed way about the approval process, but FDA also has an office that focuses specifically on rare diseases, so they can talk about that. But in general, in terms of approval, if there is a disease area where there is no treatment at all, or perhaps there is a treatment but it maybe was 20, 30 years. There are different types of tracks for approval. Accelerated approval is one of those. So those are things where the data differently, or in terms of the phase trials, it sort of depends. So maybe with some of the rare disease areas, they will see it as a priority to make sure that the product, the drug or whatever, drug, device, or biologic is in the market. But of course, all of that depends on the balance. Everything at FDA is about weighing the potential benefit versus the potential risk. And then that's something that we obviously look at very closely. But having the patient voice is very important in that. And sometimes people can physically come to FDA, but that's why I was kind of mentioning some of these public meetings and stuff, because that's a way to get your perspective included even if you can't be there. An example of this is for Rare Disease Day this year, FDA announced that we were having a public meeting. The meeting was actually back in April, and it focused on rare diseases. We talked about clinical trials, and it was patient focused. So we heard directly from patients and caregivers in the audience about what's important to you when you're trying to be involved with clinical trials. And that's the way we take that information, and then we use that in terms of developing whether it's reports or guidance documents, and it helps inform FDA's thinking. So that's one way to make sure that your voice is included, especially knowing that you're representing a rare disease area.
Do we have any other questions? We have one in the back.
Hi.
Hi.
I know a lot of our kids are probably on various medications, and what we've noticed is that our daughter, any rare side effect generally is what she gets, and we oftentimes don't know what those rare side effects are until it happens and she's hospitalized, or it's like the complete opposite of what's supposed to happen. And I guess what I'd like to see is something out there that indicates, like when you say you have a heart condition or you have a this or you have epilepsy, Is there something like that that we could do for our kids, or any kids, people with rare disorders or diseases, but obviously more specifically chromosome disorders, because the makeup of our children is so different and how they process things is way different. And I don't want to be in a situation where our child is in danger of death because of a situation like that. No matter how many times we try to talk about that with a provider, they might say, oh, well, we've worked with chromosome kids before. Well, okay, there are differences in chromosomes. Down syndrome is quite different than 8p. And there's a lot more medical complications, generally speaking. So I guess that's what I just wanted to say, is there something out there that we could do that to get them more on board, the providers on board with where we are?
So you mentioned a couple of things, and I'm nodding with you as you're talking, because part of what you mentioned at first is if you are experiencing adverse events. Well, part of it is like, how do you know that is this something I am supposed to be experiencing or not? And through our MedWatch program, we encourage you to report it even if you aren't totally sure. We have staff at FDA who their whole entire job is to evaluate the data that comes in through that. So it could be, there have been cases where 7 or 8 reports from around the country, whether it comes from a physician, whether it comes from a caregiver, whether it comes from a patient, there are safety signals that they look at in evaluating, is this product potentially causing this? Is this something that we need to know about? So when in doubt, if you're not sure, you can always report it. It's FDA's job. That is part of our job, is to make sure that things that are already on the market are still safe, or that people are informed about that. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, because you were talking about differences within, chromosomal differences. Part of that goes back to the research. So when a product is approved, it's not always possible for whoever has been enrolled in that clinical trial may not represent all the different kinds of backgrounds of people who may take that product. So even as an example, there can be a lack of diversity in clinical trials. And so because of that, people might experience a product or might have different side effects or things that aren't necessarily studied. And that's why reporting to the FDA after something is approved helps us make better decisions that can then inform other folks whether there are things that we need to do sort of differently, or do we need to change the label? Is this something that we need to work with health professionals on? I do have to say that my office focuses on patient affairs, but FDA also has an office that focuses, that works specifically with health professionals, and they do communication with doctors, nurses, and pharmacists as well. So a lot of this information that I'm talking about is also applicable and relevant to your physicians as well. So they are getting that information from us.
Okay, we have a question right up here with this
Do
gentleman.
you mind if I add just one thing to that? We had something done called a metabolic panel through GeneDx, and it shows how your child breaks down specific drugs and how likely they will be to have side effects based on that drug. You might want to just check into that as well, because it helped us pick the right drug for him when he was going through his seizure medication.
And also, this is where the collective power of your community comes together, because if we can create some kind of handbook or guidebook, getting the information from all of you on what works and what doesn't, and putting it into some kind of document that we can share with healthcare providers, school administrators, that is going to be a great resource as well. So it's really, we have a lot of work that we can also do to help other families who are just coming into this, so they don't have to experience those adverse side effects that other families are starting to experience. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No.
All right, gentleman up here.
First off, thank you for coming. Thank you for giving a presentation today.
Thanks for having me.
I noticed a small blurb up there on medical devices. I know FDA stands for drugs, but also, is there any advocacy or opportunity for FDA to push for the necessity of medical devices for people in rare disease communities? Because you look around this room and see almost every one of these kids has something. And I would be willing to bet most of us paid for most or all of that out of our own pockets rather than insurance companies. Is there any way to help advocate on behalf of us to get insurance companies to cover more things that they consider niceties rather than necessities. For example, my son had to have a wheelchair to go to public school, which is required by the Department of Education. But the devices to allow him to get on that school bus were not covered by the insurance company. And I know all our insurance companies are different, but is there any way to increase our advocacy through you and the push that the FDA and the government has upon insurance companies to cover more things that we need to just deal with our children and get them what they need?
Sure. So FDA, we haven't historically worked directly with insurance companies because the role of FDA in terms of products that are out there, whether it's a drug or a device, is about approval and then monitoring after something is approved. But certainly, what you're referring to about prices, right? We understand that some of these products out there are very expensive. Things are not covered by insurance. So because FDA sits under an umbrella of HHS, we do, I would say, more on a departmental level. We work with CMS. They're the ones that manage Medicare and Medicaid. So those conversations exist sort of beyond the scope of my office specifically. But we don't work directly with insurance companies. But I do want to say that even in the rare disease listening sessions that I mentioned, one of the things that always comes up, and it's important for FDA to know, is that when people are talking about what are some of the biggest burdens that they're experiencing, cost routinely comes up. Those are things that we're recording that information, and we can share that with high-level FDA leadership like the commissioner, and perhaps there are conversations that need to happen sort of beyond my office about that. The other thing that we try to do in general about pricing is the approvals of generics as well. So that can do something to keep the cost down. But yeah, we haven't specifically worked with insurance companies directly. So.
Any other questions? All right. Oh, we have one more question. We'll get you a microphone.
Just a follow-up. So you said that your office was formed out of funding from the 21st Century Cures Act?
So there's, part of some of these programs,
From part of it. And so is that act permanent? Was it a 5-year thing? Is it expiring? What's the deal with it?
So that funding's already been allocated. So yeah. So you don't have to worry about that.
Yes. So in the future, if we want to continue to support funding for patient outreach and all the things that came with that act, is there a new round of advocacy that needs to happen to get another one of those acts?
So as a federal employee, I can't answer that question because it's tied into...
Do you have funding after that funding?
FDA does have, there is always funding that goes towards health and human services. So I don't want you to think that is the only way that FDA does get funding. We always have funding. It's just a matter of, think about it, how much funding? Are there certain laws and acts and things like that give extra funding? And sometimes that goes into different priorities, whether it's different disease areas or, in this case, for our case, it was specific to patients. Yeah. But what I encourage people who are interested in making sure funding happens is to reach out to your congressmen or congresswomen and talk within the advocacy community about what you can do to ensure that federal agencies like FDA, like NIH, receive more funding.
Are you aware of any other package of bills or acts that would be similar to what that act did, that is in discussion or in conversation?
I am personally not aware of that. Yeah.
But you know what? This is, if you want to write down the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, that's basically our policy arm of the rare disease community. They're the ones that initiated and brought together the entire rare disease community to work on behalf of 21st Century Cures. And I could say from personal experience, having been doing this for a decade, since the initiation of that act and the new Patient Affairs Office, we have seen an incredibly positive change in the way the FDA has been working with rare disease groups. So if legislative is your thing, definitely connect with them or connect with me and I can introduce you. So thank you very much, Susan. That was very helpful.
Thank you for having. Thank you so much.
And Susan has her cards here, but we can also email you her information if you come up with some ideas at a later time.
I'll put these up front.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. All right. So when you guys walked in, we handed you guys some conference surveys. If you guys would love to do this conference again in a couple years or next year or so, and you don't have a survey, please raise your hand. Robert will get you one. Please be open and honest on how the survey is, what worked, what didn't, what you liked, what you'd like to see. Because your feedback, your honest feedback, is critically important to being able to develop an even better conference next year. So I'm going to bring on our next speaker, who is someone I have worked with as he's distributing surveys. Dr. Maya Doyle is she's a professor of social work here in New York. I have been working with her for 7-8 years now. Just 5. I just feel like I've known you forever. She is probably one of the premier mental health specialists, social workers in the rare disease community. She's been working with the rare disease community for 20 years. So we're going to kind of shift it from the medical, the research, and the FDA, and bring it into something that really is more impactful and more meaningful to the way we live our daily lives. So if you give me a second to get your slides, if you want to do an introduction on you.
I can do a little introduction on me while this is coming up. So you may or may not have seen my bio in the things that were handed out in your folders, but just so you know, who is this random social worker and why is she talking to us today? I myself grew up with a chronic health condition. I still have said chronic health condition. And growing up with I will screw this up, Kara, just so you know. I will blank out this screen at least once during my presentation. I grew up with a chronic health condition. My parents and I had an interesting time growing up with said condition. And when I decided to go to social work school, I said, well, I want to work in healthcare and I want to work in pediatrics. I had no idea what I was getting into. But I have been in pediatric social work for about 20 years. I worked at 2 hospitals here in New York City. First in general peds, so pretty much anybody, I would walk into a room, I never knew who I was going to be talking to. I developed the ability to talk to just about anybody, as many of you in this room probably know, because I've intruded on all of your conversations in the course of the last few days, and I've been eavesdropping on the rest of you. So thank you, all of you, for being so willing to share and let me lurk in your conversations. And I moved into a specialization in about 2000 in pediatric nephrology. The first patient I ever took care of, my first transplant patient, had a rare condition. And she and her mother pulled me into coming to their advocacy group meetings. And over time, I started doing more and more work in that rare disease space. And when I went back to get my doctorate a couple years ago, almost a decade ago, I did my research talking to rare disease families, particularly around the transition from pediatric to adult care. And we're all going to get there in this room. Right? That's a project among many others that we have for 8P. So that's been the world that I've been involved with, and I've gotten to know Carrie through that, and then gotten to talk to a lot of families. So what I'm going to share with you today is not stuff that I got out of a textbook, some of it I did, and not stuff that I know, although some of it I know, but a lot of it is what I've heard from other rare disease families about what's been successful and helpful for them, what's allowed them to live with their condition or their child's condition. So I hope that this is all helpful. Oh, I did it right, yay. So we're really going to talk about I have some sort of broad strategies that I think are helpful for folks. There is no one way to define what it means to be successful, to live with a chronic health condition or with a rare disorder, but you kind of know it when you got it, right? We meet families and you can see that we're kind of on an arc. We kind of know what we're doing. And then other days and weeks and years, you're like, we're completely being bowled over by this, right? So what are the strategies that help people feel sort of more in the black than in the red on a regular basis? And I would never try to define family. We all define families for ourselves. There's so many different kinds of families, and we are creating new family here today. So who are the people that are in your family, right? Is it your immediate family? It's your It's parents and siblings and those folks coming together. It's grandparents, it's aunts and uncles and cousins. It's neighbors, it's friends, it's community members, it's your healthcare team. It can be this whole room of people now, right? So what it means to be a family and how you use that structure, because most of us, that's how we live. Even if you have family that you don't get along with so well, you don't really want to spend time with, but they still influence how you think, right? And who you are. And we'll talk a little bit about that idea of perception of yourself and perception of other people. So that's why I focus on families, not just individuals, although we do a lot of work, thinking about how do we help individuals develop, grow, take care of themselves as well. And I'm sorry, I keep tilting back and looking at this. I should know this by heart by now. So language is difficult because there are lots of different ways we can describe, right, the condition, the syndrome, the disease, the chromosome rearrangement that you may use. But I tend to use the words disease and illness, and I want you to know how I use them so you understand why I use them. Disease is really the sort of biologic, bodily condition, right? And in this case, a genetic condition, processes, cognitive processes. When I use the word illness, and I don't even like that word, it's an imperfect word, it's not always quite what I want. But illness is about the perception and the experience of whatever your diagnosis happens to be. And in this situation, right, it's a chromosome 8p difference. How you encounter the world and how the world encounters you. How you encounter even other members of your family and how they encounter you and how they encounter your child, right? It's different. And for those of you with, say, normally developing kids alongside your 8p hero, right, you see perhaps that the world interacts differently with those kids. And it changes your everyday life, right? It changes what happens on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis, and I'm going to ask you all about that. I got lots of questions for you, don't worry. I'm going to shut up in a minute. The other thing about how illness is perceived. There is a way illness is perceived by your healthcare team, right? There is a long checklist of all of these things, and we've heard about so many of them this weekend, right? All of these different systems and areas that we need to keep an eye on, that we need to keep track of, what's going on developmentally, what's going on with neurologic things, cardiac things, GI things, infectious disease things, all those pieces, right? All those things that are what's wrong and how do we fix it? That's what the medical model is about. But the other thing to think about is what we talk about, the social model of disability, right? How we understand what it means to have a disability in the world. And it could be a visible illness or disability. It could be something that's invisible. But the reality is, our world, as of yet, is not really set up, right, for the needs of folks and for the everyday lives of folks with disabilities. Have you guys had a time in New York City? You run into any challenges getting around? Getting in and out? Tell us. Do I have a microphone over here somewhere? We need runners. Where are our runners? Okay, talk loud.
Our runners are running.
Who had something to tell me about their time in New York City? Talk loud.
Here, I got it.
She can talk loud.
What's been interesting for my family in New York City is how I thought it was actually going to be harder than it ended up being.
Oh, okay, good.
I had hoped that we would be able to use the subway. Is this projecting? Okay. So I'd hoped that we'd be able to use the subway, but it turns out that a quarter of the subway stops are actually handicap accessible, and so that got me very anxious about being able to get around the city. And then, but what we found out is that the cabs and the apps related to getting a cab and the quantity of cabs that have a wheelchair
that are accessible,
that is way better than any other, my city or other cities that I've been to. And then also that we've had success with the bus system. So the bus system and all the buses already having the ramps on them has been enjoyable too. So there was an anxiety level about the communication of accessibility, because they don't really tell you, no, there's going to be plenty of cabs with and of course the waiting outside is not pleasant, and you do have to wait, but the communication about transportation could be better, because I was really worried about it.
Right. So there are all these things about sort of the way our world is put together. Even in this room, right? We have room for wheelchairs and strollers down front and in the back. I have a colleague who's a wheelchair user herself who teaches at a university, and she can't walk around and see what all of her students are doing the way I can, because the rooms that she's given to teach in at an esteemed university are not particularly accessible. So there are lots of things, and those are just big examples, right? But there are lots of ways in which the world does not completely accommodate all kinds of difference, right? And so that leaves us in the role of always sort of being in the role of having to advocate and having to fight. But wouldn't it be nice if just no, the world is set up to make it easy, rather than all of the sort of battle that one has to have to get needs met for your kids, right? And needs met get for yourself. Something else I want to mention is that, as you saw from the title of my talk, right, I talk about living with illness, living with a condition. I try really hard as a social worker, and you'll probably think this is really funny, but as a social worker, I try really hard to avoid the word coping. I don't like it. Do you guys like the word coping? No? Why not? We need a runner.
Who is it? Oh, I can shout.
Okay.
I don't think that's actually applies to how I feel at all. I mean, it's completely inaccurate. I always reference all of us in the room as like warriors and try to think of positive things and strength, and courage. And so, I don't know, there's a struggle. It's hard, but coping is definitely
it's a horrible.
Just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's not a word that I like. Coping is a great concept if you're talking about stress and coping, and that's where it comes from, right? You have, all right, I'm not going to lose this, right? You have stress, you have a stressor, something going on, and coping is I have resources and strategies I'm going to use, and then here's the outcome that I've managed or maybe not managed to address that stressor. Your child's condition is not just a random stressor. You have lots of individual things that may be stressors that you have to cope with, but really you have this whole life experience, right? You are living with and totally surrounded by, perhaps, the diagnosis that your child or loved one, or you yourself, right, are living with. So I try really hard with everybody that I talk to kind of bring that message across, that we are living with, but we are also incorporating this into our lives. It becomes part of your life. It takes time for it to become part of your life, right? People are at different spaces here based on the age of your kids, the kind of team you're working with, the knowledge that you have, right, of where you are in that process. But it is a process. It's not something that just happens, and it's going to change over time. So I'm a professor now. I probably always was in my mind long before I got that degree. Right, so this is information that I kind of share with my students, but I want you to think about the way we try to teach healthcare professionals to understand that idea about the experience of illness. How do we define what illness is? And there are lots of different ways that I hope that my students and healthcare professionals that I interact with are thinking about these kind of aspects when we're talking to families. And we're going to look at, I have a sort of draft in my mind of how we might think about AP and use that to help perhaps the folks that you're working with understand the disease, right? Some illnesses happen completely unexpectedly. Others, we know what's coming down the road, whether it's because of genetic testing, because of something that runs in your family. You may have things that, we sort of know that this is in our future and we can plan for, as opposed to this happens out of nowhere. Things may be genetic. They may be something from exposure in the environment. It could be from infection, right? Lots of different things might kick off disease and might kick off illness for people. Some things are rare, some things are common. Some things are progressive, meaning they're getting worse over time. There's some things that are kind of stable. We know what to expect. There's some things that are episodic. Certain seizure disorders, asthma, all kinds of things like that. So the way we understand an illness, right, and can help then communicate to families, this is what to expect. So as I've been lurking around the 8P community and doing a lot of reading, these are the things that I sort of pulled together first, but I am curious to know from you all how you might define this illness, right? It's genetic in that something has changed, right? You have a difference in chromosome 8. It's not genetic in the way that some of the other genetic diseases are, in that, we see that this runs in families, or parents are carriers, or things like this. 8P, as far as we know, right, that's not the case. It's de novo. It's something that just occurs in your particular child, and we don't know the reasons why yet. And not knowing reasons why can be really frustrating, right? Why did this happen to us? Is there any explanation for this? That can be challenging. We don't have an identified cause at this point. Some of you, from talking to all of you, some of you knew through prenatal testing that something was going on for your child. Some folks knew in early childhood, or when your baby was born, or you knew that, hey, something's up and we need to look further to understand what's going on. So there are definitely different trajectories in this room. And you may not have got a diagnosis. What's our mix of sort of age of diagnosis? So we have folks who knew when your baby was born, right? Because you had some testing ahead of time. Who sort of had some information within, say, 6 months of birth? I knew afterwards. You knew afterwards. Oh, you knew at birth. Okay. Right. So you knew right away, fairly quickly. Gotcha. Right. And then are there folks where it took a couple of years? Yeah. Wow. Right. That's the infamous diagnostic journey we talk about with rare diseases. It's, what's the average, Carrie? 7 or 8 years for some people to get diagnoses. Do we have a story? Yeah? We were 4. You were 4? 21 years ago. 21 years ago. Well, that's amazing. 4 years is not ideal, though, right? 4 years is not ideal. What am I missing about 8P in this list?
What are you missing?
Yeah.
Actually, it's not entirely de novo, I don't think. Maybe that's not it is occasionally linked back to the mom, to a gene.
Okay, interesting. That's why I'm not a medical doctor. Right. Yeah.
Sorry, I said... Oh, is it on? I didn't think... Oh, sorry. I feel like I'm hearing myself. No, I guess the wrong thing, but I said it's actually, I don't believe it's entirely de novo. A doctor here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know in some cases it is, but in some cases, because I had my daughter 24 years ago and they told me it was de novo, and then after I'd had 4 children, they put in the literature that in some cases it has been linked back to a normal gene on the mother, that I believe it's approximately 45% of Europeans carry and about 35% of Japanese, and it's a normal gene, and it just sometimes gets too stuck. It's too tacky.
Got it.
Too gluey.
Okay, interesting. So good. So see, I'm glad I asked that question.
We have a comment over here.
Hi. I just wanted to add to that. Like you wrote, not inherited typically, right? So it is a bullet up there, and that's correct. So majority of the cases are de novo. We do have several families in the research study at Project 8P that both mother or father and child have it.
Right.
And we're just continuing to better understand, causes and what that really means.
Right. So there's a lot for us still to learn, and that's why being involved in those research studies is so important, because there may be a lot we don't know. And so some of this is really what I pulled out of the literature that I found so far to sort of understand this. And there's only more to learn and be able to share in the future, but when we want to be able to then share this back to providers, right, that this is the experience that we're having. So when you got your child's diagnosis, or even before you got that diagnosis, but you knew that something's going on, something's different for my child, it affects everything. It affects what's happening in your family life. In that moment in time, we think of what normal family development might be like, right? You fall in love, you have a baby, you have all these expectations for what maybe being a family is going to be like. So what happened when you realize that something's different from my kid, or if you have a doc come in and give you, okay, here's some information. What has that change been like?
We have a comment up here.
Oh, I got lots of hands.
We have a mic back here. Maya, back here we have a mic. We need it mic'd.
I always worked full time, and last year I had to make the decision to leave my job. Maddie, my daughter is 7, she'll be 8 next month. I also have 4-year-old twin boys. Maddie's got pretty severe scoliosis, and while my work has been generous in letting me have the flexibility that I needed to come and go, putting your daughter in a daycare when she's 47 pounds, is reasonably incontinent, has to wear a full torso back brace, and can't walk, means that it's not practical.
Right.
So, we would regularly find our daughter in a cold, wet pull-up, sitting in a swing set, waiting for us to pick her up. And it was a good daycare. They were very loving people, but we just realized it wasn't the right environment anymore, so we had to go from a 2-income household to a single-income household. It was purely a survival mechanism, we felt like, so it was a big, drastic change for us.
Yeah, that's a big, drastic change for you as a family. It's a big, drastic change for you also as a person, as mom, right? What you might have expected your work trajectory to be, your family trajectory to be, is now very different than you might have expected, and you do it because you need to do it. You make those big decisions, but it puts you in a very different place.
And we have a comment
for sure.
The microphone over there on the left.
In my case, what touched me most is my relationship with my oldest daughter. She was 2.5 years old when our son came, and it's been a strain not only on the parents but on her and on our relationship. We're in therapy right now, family therapy, hoping to fix as much
Not excellent
as we
that
can.
you're having that, but excellent that you're in therapy.
No, but it's how many times as parents we ask the questions, why is this happening to us? The siblings also go.
Yes, absolutely.
And they're younger than us, so they don't have our maturity, and they don't get the answers as quickly as we do to that question, and it's really hard on them, and they're often forgotten.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So we have to think about this changes things for all the members of the family.
For us, I think that's the toughest thing. The rest we adjusted. I stayed home, and I think it makes a whole lot of difference in my son's life. He wouldn't be where he is right now if I wouldn't have all that time for him. And I'm not stressed by a job, so I can give him all the hours he needs, because it's, if somebody has homework in the same classroom, it takes them 20 minutes, but it takes them 2 hours.
Right.
So I have to be able to sit down for those 2 hours.
So your whole pace is different.
Yeah.
Right.
We have another comment, a similar comment back there.
I think got the diagnosis at like 8 months, I think, and it was a relief for me because I knew something was not right, but everybody else was thinking I was like crazy. So for me, getting the diagnosis while I'm sitting in the car